Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you to the organizers and to all of you. We have a company that develops panels, photovoltaic panels, that are like solar panels that you're probably all familiar with now, panels that convert sunlight to electricity. Our panels are based on similar technology, but they convert heat to electricity. And our operation began in Wuhan, China, about 4 years ago. But I think it's worth, just as introduction, sharing a bit of personal background. That partly happened because my own personal interest in Asia started, and I'm dating myself, in 1977 when I started college and wanted to learn Mandarin. Well, I made it about 2 weeks into the course and then was overwhelmed with all the other courses and didn't make it further than that. Fortunately, we have 4 children. They've all studied Mandarin, and one of them has made it to fluency so far. So I'm always humbled when I'm before an audience like this, you know. You all hear us speak in English, and you speak at least one other language, and that has actually been an important feed into starting operation in China. Our technology was born at MIT, and really our China operation was born at MIT also, and at MIT Sloan specifically. It was a classmate of mine. Fortunately, in our class of 100 Sloan Fellows, there were 5 from mainland China, 14 from Japan, 4 from Singapore, 1 from Malaysia. So we were blessed, really, with significant Asian representation. And one of those members from mainland China became an investor in our company early on, which we spun out right after Sloan. His investment was in part out of his personal interest to have our technology come to China as well. That was not a quid pro quo. That was not a requirement of his investment, but it was an interest of his. So this was 4 years ago, and we went to China. People said, oh, you're going there for the low-cost manufacturing. We said, well, that's one of the reasons, but it's not the top reason. Oh, you're going there for cost-effective technical talent. And we said, well, yes, that's certainly one of the reasons, but it's not the top reason. The top reason was the markets. We were going there for the market. And that was the number one reason. Second reason was the technical talent. And third reason was the low-cost manufacturing. So in the Q&A, I'm happy to give more details on this and any piece of it that's of particular interest. I will say that we started with 6 people in Wuhan. We now have 1 person in Wuhan. We did just close a $10 million round. 2/3 of it, we're about to close the last third in the next couple of weeks. But the economic downturn in 2008 did impact, I would say, our ability in the U.S. to effectively utilize the capacity that we had built in Wuhan. And I think that there are 2 key differences that we've experienced. And one was sort of a challenge, and one was a real positive for us. One was that our office in Wuhan, and Peter was talking about this in the larger context, there were no egos that we could detect. In the U.S., that's not usually the case. And that was a real positive. We had 6 very talented people, and although we had an office manager, he wasn't a technical person. The technical staff was loath to the thought of one of them being a manager, because they were all the same age. They were all recent graduates. And that was somewhat of a challenge for us, because we didn't have, as a company of 12 people, we didn't have enough staff and enough bandwidth. We were so busy creating this new technology, this new product line, that we didn't have enough staff to really leverage the skill set in China. And looking back, I think that we needed to be a little bit closer to actual product line. And when we get to that point, we look forward very much to ramping this up, and this is why we have kept the one extremely talented engineer there in Wuhan so that we are ready to ramp up as we get closer to product. So that was positive in that there were no egos and there was always a real team effort, which as Peter described, we see here, and it's all your compliment, but it was actually somewhat of a challenge fitting that in with the culture in the U.S., or the sort of the culture of management in the U.S. The other thing was that in the U.S., and perhaps this is because of the entrepreneurial ecosystem that exists here in Cambridge, which is where we've been basically, there was an orientation to sort of take orders, to take command, to take direction. And in an early stage company, that's one of the hardest things to figure out sometimes. What is the next thing to do? What's the agenda? How to prioritize the queue of things that any particular individual staff member has to do. And so that's something that, I mean, even in the 4 years that we've been at it, we've seen that change in Asia, in our little window into Asia, that kind of the transition from command and control to sort of autonomous action. So I think that's probably gives you a sense of where we've been and how we got there, and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you very much.
And now I'd like to introduce Les Ross, who is the managing partner of the Beijing office of WilmerHale and an experienced China hand.
This one. Well, thank you, Peter, for the introduction, and thank you all for giving us so much of your time today. It's been a long program. As Peter said, we're based in Beijing. We represent companies and from different clients, from different sides in China and also to some extent in Mongolia. We've also had a few clients who've asked us about North Korea. It's fair to say that they were early, and they still are early in terms of North Korea. We represent entrepreneurs. In fact, companies, one of them was mentioned earlier today in the energy panel. Andrew discussed CNPV. We represented CNPV in its negotiations with Andrew's fund. Andrew is a very tough negotiator. I'd like to think we also work very hard in terms of protecting our clients' interests. And I think as a result, the company has benefited and done much better. We also represent entrepreneurs who are not necessarily only Chinese. We represent Americans and Chinese in combination as well. So another side of the energy profile, certainly in China, the biggest side for now and for some considerable time in the future, is going to be coal. So we represented a company that established coal mining machinery manufacturing. And they then sold a chunk of that company off to a private equity fund. That private equity fund is in turn in the process of selling that interest to one of the world's leading coal mine manufacturing companies. For the other part of that company, we did a reverse takeover on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange market, and now that company as well has received an offer from a different major coal mining machinery company. We also represent investment banks. Last week, we had established Kwan's business in China. Last week, Kwan, actually it's this week, because it was Tuesday and Wednesday in China, held its first China investment conference in Beijing. Their focus is on energy, healthcare, and food and beverage. Large numbers of companies and prospective clients came to that as well. We also represent investment funds. We put investment funds together. So we represent Qing Capital, which is the investment arm of Tsinghua University. We represent Founder, which is the investment arm of Beijing University. And we represent a number of limited partners from different parts of the world, from the Middle East, from Europe, from North America. So our job really is to put these pieces together on behalf of our client. Whatever nationality the client is, whatever the industry is, whether they're providing the money, whether they're not providing the money and are seeking the money. We do so in order to protect our clients' interests and to advance our clients' interests in going forward so that their company, the entrepreneurial side, grows. If we look at China as a whole, relative to Japan, relative to Korea, we find that entrepreneurship is more likely to take place outside of a large company outside of a chaebol than would be the case in those other jurisdictions. But it doesn't mean that China is necessarily the same as it is everywhere else. The biggest single difference in terms of China is the pervasive influence of what one might consider the party state, that is, the Communist Party and the state. Now, clearly, China is not a communist country in the sense that it is anti-capitalist. It is very much in tune, despite what the rhetoric says, in terms of being in favor of a market economy and in terms of, as Deng Xiaoping is known to have said, or is believed to have said, to let some people get rich first. As long as the cat catches mice, it doesn't make any difference whether it's black or white. But having said that, the party is very important, and that means that there are different kinds of constraints that operate. Clearly, one of them is that it's much harder to attract bank money, to attract loans. Chen Yuan of China Development Bank made that point very clearly. You don't have collateral, you don't have government support, it's much harder to get basic money. And indeed, that phenomenon has, if anything, gotten worse over the last couple of years as the state-owned economy has advanced and the private economy has retreated at its expense, right? If we look at it otherwise, in terms of the capital markets, if we look at it in terms of being able to raise money through the bond markets, there are also shortcomings in that regard. But the recent introduction in China of the Shenzhen Second Board has certainly made a big help in that regard. There are currency constraints. So, obviously, China's currency is convertible on the current account, but it's not convertible on the capital account. We did an acquisition earlier this year for a company here in Massachusetts, Hologic. Hologic is the world leader in terms of female health, medical devices, breast imaging, and so forth. Made an acquisition there of a Chinese company. In fact, we did more than one. But in this particular case, that targeted company was faced with the issue of what do they do in order to grow? Do they go public? If they were going to go public, do they go public in China, or do they go public overseas? If they go public in China, then they have to be in China at this point in time, because foreign companies can't list in China. If they list overseas, then they've got to migrate their assets. They've got to migrate the ownership offshore. So that's what they had started to do, and then our client comes along and says, no, we'll buy you out. And they signed a lot of negotiations, of course, agreed to do it. Well, then we, as lawyers, had to work with them to unwind half of that structure because we wanted that structure to be offshore ownership. We had to get rid of the other stuff and so forth. And then in addition to that, in terms of an exit through a trade sale, and in some cases also, of course, through the capital markets, you've also got to recognize that there are government approvals that are associated with doing things. It's not like India in the sense that you've got the license Raj that prevents companies from doing a great number of things, as people earlier today have said. But there are still lots and lots of approvals. You need lots of support from government, and Allan has said that already. And in terms of actually an acquisition by a foreign company, if that's what you intend to do, well, then you've got to go through not only the foreign investment approval process, you've also, in many cases, got to go through an anti-monopoly or an antitrust approval process. And in some cases now, there's also a national security review process, regardless of what almost regardless of what the industry is. So these are some of the things that we deal with all the time in trying to help make China more successful in terms of entrepreneurship and innovation. But in doing so, we also make the world better. And I'll stop here. Thank you.